Good afternoon. I think Commissioner Plan is running a few minutes late, but asked us to get started, so we will. Uh, Good afternoon. I'm Eric Blank, and today is Thursday, July 25th, 2024. This is the Commissioner's Information Meeting on an electric rate forecasting tool developed by Mr. Steve Wishart, and a more general discussion of long-term rate and affordability issues led by Ms. O'Neill from our trial staff. And just by way of background, I'd say I've been in Colorado for over 30 years, and most of that time our electric rates have generally been affordable, often at or below the national average. In contrast, in certain states such as California, it appears that electric rates may have doubled in the last 10 years, with a noticeable inflection point occurring when rates got between average retail rates got between 15 and 20 cents a kilowatt hour. In Colorado, as our rates approach 15 cents a kilowatt hour, I'm concerned we may be experiencing a similar inflection point where rapidly growing capital spending and volatile natural gas prices may be already altering our rate trajectory. At the same time, legislation such as Senate Bill 21-272 and Senate Bill 23-291 have required us to explore affordability and rate impact issues in more detail. In this environment, as individual capital expenditure plans come before us, often with multi-decade depreciation schedules, I've sometimes struggled to understand and balance long-term rate impacts against other clean energy, safety, and reliability goals. We've been asking our regulated utilities for a while now to provide this type of long-term rate impact modeling tool based upon and calibrated with the capital and other commitments that the company is making to the financial community. So I'm really excited to have this tool available and hope it can help us balance long-term rate concerns against other goals as we move forward through various proceedings that seek our approval to spend large amounts of capital. So that, Commissioner Gilman, any opening comments you'd like to make on the model, rate impacts, affordability, or anything else you'd like to say?
Sure. Well, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And I'm looking forward to this. I think it's very helpful to have a tool, especially that we can use that can provide kind of a consistent and non-confidential forum to understand future rates. And part of my interest will be how we kind of continue to keep this current in terms of what inputs from future proceedings need to kind of be updated in here, and potentially what outputs from a tool like this could allow us to use consistent information or data inputs across proceedings, whereas right now we have seen different inputs for the same exact information, if you will, across different proceedings. So I'm very interested in those aspects, as well as your more general point of looking down the road, especially when we pile together all of the many different issues that we see, many times often separate from each other, and see how that looks in the future for our electric and gas utilities. Understandably, today is just about electric, but I have quite a bit of interest in kind of the same situation for gas, especially so we can see comparatively how those look as we go into the future. But look forward to understanding it better, and think this will be a very helpful forum for us to understand how to continue to use this tool.
Well said. I guess that's a big part of it. We always see one piece, and it's tough to get it all looked at comprehensively. So with that, Mr. Wishart, Ms. O'Neill, you want to take us away?
Thank you much, commissioners. Let me pull up the slide deck here that we prepared. Is everybody seeing the screen?
Yep.
Super. All right. So thank you for the introduction. My name is Steve Wishart. I am formerly with Public Service Colorado. I currently work with Concentric Energy Advisors. I have for almost a year now. Quick outline. A lot of this discussion got spurred on by the California rate analysis that came out in 2023. I'm going to go through a model description and base case results. And then Aaron is going to take over with some scenario modeling and conclusions. Okay, so affordability overview. This data, I believe, comes from EIA. Essentially, it shows that Colorado has been really close to national average rates for a long time. Contrast that with California utilities, who have traditionally been above the national average and are trending upward at a rather rapid rate. When you see something like this happen in California, I think it's prudent to take a look at what's going on there, see if you can have some lessons learned, see if you can apply those to your own state. Yeah. So this is a little bit more about the California study, Bill 695. The chart on the left shows all the revenue requirements for the big three utilities in California, trying to identify which cost categories are really driving these increases in rates. And you can see that it's interesting, the blue line at the bottom, generation, is actually tailing down. I think they may have had some nuclear retirements that may have helped there, but interesting that the revenue requirements for generation in California is actually trending down. It's also possible that's getting replaced with purchase power. But distribution is growing and transmission is growing. And through some conversations I understood that a lot of that is wildfire related. There's obviously some, regular distribution transmission investments going on, but I do understand that a lot of these increases, especially in the 22, 23 timeframes that we're seeing there, are driven by wildfire investments and hardening the grid from that perspective. Chart on the right is net metering. Everyone's heard about net metering in California, what a big deal it's been. They went from net metering 1.0 to 2.0. That shift involved moving to TOU rates, and now they moved on to 3.0, which has more TOU rates. It has different export charges for energy exported into the grid, has some grid access charges. So they are trying to address this, but you can see that the PG&E estimated that the cost impacts associated with net metering and the cost shifts are in the range of $1 billion. And that's in the context, I believe PG&E total revenue is about $16 billion. So impacts of net metering in California have been very large. In Colorado, the penetration of solar isn't nearly as high, and the cost impacts are lower just because overall rates are lower. But it still is an issue that should be thought of when it comes to thinking about affordability.
Steve, this is Alex. Can you just throw this in presentation mode?
I can try.
Just at the, I think if you do, there's a button at the bottom, or
better?
yes. Thanks so much.
Yeah, this way we get the kind of neat transition that pops up.
Well done. Thank you, Alex.
No problem. Thanks, Steve.
Model description and base case. I like that transition. Okay, this is a little bit of the scope of work that we talked about early in this project. We've been working on this since around New Year's. And the challenge given to me was to provide the PUC with a working model that can adapt to changing circumstances to help everybody understand, the impact of rates in the future. Specifically a 30-year model with a little 10-year history appended to it. That was easy to add. The rest of that paragraph talks about a 15-year detailed and a 15-year after that being kind of a more generic. But if you're going to build a detailed 15-year model, it's really easy just to continue that same methodology for the next 15 years. So that's really what I did. So really no difference between year 1 and year 30 in this model. Laundry list on the right was given to me to try to anticipate what this model should be used for and what it should be able to do. Lots of stuff here. Looking at capital investments, new generating resources and retiring fossil fuel resources, fuel costs, different approaches to capital investment, including accelerated depreciation and securitization, different drivers to demand. There's a load forecast built into the model. It's not so accurate that you can differentiate between population growth, say, and some other reasons for load growth. But it does have load forecast built in there, and then financial levers. At one point, something I said about this model is like, I'm trying to build a model that'll answer everybody's questions, no matter what they are. And it was daunting. And it was a long laundry list of things I tried to address, and hopefully it meets expectations. A little bit more about what I built here. It's a spreadsheet model. I'm not a computer programmer, but I do like to think I can do fairly well in Microsoft Excel. So it's a spreadsheet-based model. That's everybody should be familiar with. If there's a question you have about a certain equation and you're adept at doing spreadsheet stuff, you can trace through the model and find out where everything comes from. Capital and all the things associated with capital, depreciation, return taxes, deferred taxes. O&M is pretty easy. There's several functional categories of O&M built into the model, but modeling O&M is inherently fairly easy to do. Fuel and purchase energy costs, those are in there. And because it was communicated to me that the user may like to look at things like changes in net metering or resource additions or resource retirements, I couldn't come up with a better alternative than come up with some type of simplified dispatch simulation. It's not nearly as accurate as a utilities dispatch software that's specifically designed for it and has a bunch of people working on it to update and maintain it. But it does point you in the right direction. It's directionally correct, and it should get you in the ballpark of changes to resource assumptions. It has a user-defined expansion plan. A utility will have sophisticated long-term resource planning software that will optimize the least cost expansion plan of new units and retirements. This is not that. This is a user-defined expansion plan. So to the extent that you expect wind additions to be 200 megawatts a year for the next 30 years, you can put that into the model. Simple rate calculations, not class specific. So kind of the bottom punchline of this model is just an overall average rate, real simple, total revenue requirements divided by total sales to get to a single number. Easy enough to expect that residential rates will be above average and large C&I rates will be below average. That's just kind of how it works out based on class cost allocation. But right now the model only has a single average rate, but directionally it'll be the same for everybody. It's not like residential rates would be going up while C&I rates are going down. It can be used to model any electric utility. My hope is that this model can be used for other Colorado utilities. I'm looking at using something very similar in other jurisdictions that I've been employed into. But it's populated right now with publicly available data from Public Service Colorado. There's a lot of public data out there. Sometimes people think that electric utilities aren't transparent. It's a big mystery what they're up to, but there is a lot of public data out there for electric utilities, particularly in Colorado. So a lot of information can be gleaned just from public documents. It's a big model. It has 70 tabs, and that's just the main model. Then there's also the dispatch model, which is over 100 megabytes. My recommendation to users, unless you're changing load or expansion plans type stuff, really better to keep the dispatch model closed just because it slows things down. Then a little caveat at the end, it's not as accurate as the utilities capital asset accounting systems, their tax professionals, their revenue requirements teams, and all that. But it's fairly accurate. I think it'll get you in the ballpark. It's definitely directionally correct. And it's flexible enough to run, some really interesting comparative analysis about what if. So on that note, I think it's a lot better at running what if scenarios. If you add or subtract some capital investments, how do things change? Rather than, relying on this model to be super accurate about what average rates are going to be in 2047. Model inputs. These are some of the publicly available data that I utilized. A lot of resource plan stuff. That was critical to, model out, how many new solar panels and windmills will be coming on. That also had the load and fuel forecast in it. Capital forecast. The chair pointed me to a March 2024 investor presentation that gave a high-level indication of potential capital investments over the next 5 years. O&M forecasts are really basic. We used Appendix A, has a really good report out on how much O&M is spent in every year. So I looked at 5 years of history there, and then really it's just a trend analysis after that. New unit cost assumption. So to the extent that there are new windmills or solar panels or gas units in this rate model, those are based on the annual energy outlook that the EIA does every year or every other year, and they have published data on expected overnight cost of all sorts of different generation types. Current existing units, owned units, and their performance. A lot of that comes from FERC Form 1. FERC Form 1 reports out on the total investment in each plant. And there's also in the resource plan, has a couple nice work papers that show each and every unit, their total max capacity, and some other information about them. For the dispatch model, I use a lot of information from the EIA Grid Monitor. That's a really neat tool, and it's available for any jurisdiction around the country. It has hourly load, wind, and other generation information on it that you can download into a spreadsheet. So it's kind of nice to have that EIA Grid Monitor information. It's very informative. And I my caveat, that's not PSCO specific, that's Colorado general. But for the purposes of that dispatch model, I think it's pretty representative. Here's a little look at the model. User-defined inputs are designated with light blue. You'll see that a lot through the model. The model includes what we call the general inputs tab. This is kind of intended to be the quick and easy tab to use in the model. It has several inputs that you might be interested in changing to see how it impacts the results. And it also reports the results out on the right-hand side, not shown here. So you can change a capital input assumption and immediately see off to the right-hand side how that will change your rate forecast. And it does have a macro built into it that'll save scenarios, so you can do scenario comparison. So you can do something like, I'm going to change the capital forecast, and I'm going to change the fuel cost assumption, and I'm going to save off that scenario. Then I'm going to see how those scenarios compare on a line by line item basis, so you can dig real deep into the scenario comparison. More input discussion here. Capital is a big issue in this model. I mentioned this March 2024 capital forecast. The chart on the right, you see it's up to 19.2 billion over the 5-year total. But you do have that natural gas line in the middle, so you have to subtract that out. That gets you to 17 billion. In the model right now, has 16.6 billion. And the reason there's a difference between the 17 billion and the 16.6 billion is because the capital associated with renewables and other generation investments is really based off of that EIA annual energy outlook document that I was using. And evidently it's a little bit different than what's built into this capital forecast. So while we say the capital forecast is based on this investor presentation, it doesn't entirely match, but to the extent that you're a user of this and you want to add in an extra 0.4 billion, I guess that's 400 million, easy enough to drop that into the model to get that tie out to exactly 17 billion. And it's a big number. 17 billion, 16.6 billion is very large in context to the Appendix A for 2023 listed a current rate base of 12.6 billion. So adding 16.6 or 17 on top of 12.6 billion is big. Of course, there'll be depreciation over the next 5 years, so that 12.6 you see there won't be quite 12.6 once you get out 5 years, but just order of magnitude, it's fairly large. there's the long-term capital. So that forecast only went through 28, so you have to do something about the next 25 years in the model. So the assumption that's built into the model now is that the capital investments you saw from the investor presentation continue at that level essentially for the next 15 years, or I guess that's 25 years to get to the end of the model. So it's a lot of capital in the long term. The chart on the right, you'll see the green area is lumpy. That's the generation capital investments, and that's handled a lot by that user-defined expansion plan that I mentioned. User-defined expansion plan, I'll mention later, has some wind, has some solar, but it also fills in with combustion turbines anytime there's a capacity shortage in the system. And then the capital growth assumption right now is in there at 5%. And the concept there is that to maintain a, pardon me, a 5% earnings per share growth level, capitals have to grow at something similar. Again, really easy to change this assumption in the model so you can test different things. And I like to think that, it's reasonable to look at the first few years of this model because we have some fairly detailed information on what's going to go on over the next 5 years. After 2029, 2030, you have to start taking the results of this with a grain of salt as far as the absolute rate forecast. But I still think it's useful for looking at changes and how things change over the long term. O&M, I mentioned this earlier, it's a simple trend analysis. All the things trend really easily. You will see a little wiggle in the O&M on production that has to do with new units coming on or retiring. And for reference, Appendix A listed about $750 million in O&M expenses. So I think this is calibrated fairly closely to that. Base case, expansion plan and energy mix. So like I mentioned, we used expansion plans and retirements from the recent resource plan. It cannot optimize, so it's dependent on the user putting in a user-defined expansion plan. And right now, I looked at the commission-approved expansion plan on the last resource plan, and it looked like it averaged, not exactly, but roughly about 400 megawatts of wind a year, 400 megawatts of solar a year, not including distributed net metered stuff, and about 500 megawatts of storage. So what I did is in 2030 and beyond, I just had that exact same level of additions in each and every year. And then I mentioned that the model does track the peak demand of the system and the reserve margin. And to the extent that resources fall below the required reserve margin, the model has a simple equation that'll add a combustion turbine to the mix just to fill in that capacity gap. Graphs on the right show how the top one shows existing resources. So you see all the existing resources kind of retire over time, with the exception of solar, because that's the big chunk of solar there that doesn't retire is behind the meter solar. That's kind of expected to renew itself and grow over time. So that's a little bit different in that graph. And then in the bottom, this is a look at the total gross capacity that's built into the model at this point. And, probably not surprising to anybody, in the long-term future, if you just keep adding solar and wind and storage, that's what dominates your resource mix in the long term. System dispatch, like I mentioned, it's not as sophisticated as a complicated utility model, but you can see coal dropping off and gas decreasing some, replaced by solar and wind and battery, or storage dispatch. It's not necessarily battery, it's storage. It's kind of technology agnostic. And the reason you don't see solar grow as much as wind is because in the model, it does try to track curtailments, and something had to get curtailed first. So I set the model up to curtail solar first. Won't necessarily be true. Utilities will have a very sophisticated, curtailment strategy, based on lots of factors. But for a simple dispatch model, I just had it dispatch or curtailing solar first to the extent that renewable generation was exceeding the load. So that's why you don't see solar growing as much. And the model does attempt to track CO2. This isn't on a unit by unit basis. This is really high level. It just simply says if there's this much coal generation, it applies a single carbon emission factor to each megawatt of coal, and the same for gas. Okay, base case results. What does this look like? Revenue requirements grow quite fast. This is a steep upward climb on revenue requirements, starting from on the $404.5 billion range all the way up to over 20. So big growth on total revenue requirements. That's somewhat mitigated by offsetting growth in sales. Just because revenue requirements grow, that's not a terrible thing as long as you have offsetting sales. So sales do help tamp that down. Some of the historic, going back to 2011 to 2023, growth rate was about 1.9%, real close to what inflation was over that time, with the exception of the past couple of years. And you see that in this chart that you got a little hook in the past couple of years when inflation and other factors kind of caught up. In the near term, 2024 to 30, which is a little bit more reliable in this model, there's a 6% growth rate there year over year, and that's driven a large part by that $17 billion in capital investment. And I should make the caveat, and I should on the previous slide, that we're treating those capital investments as capital going into service. And there's a difference. If you can spend $1 billion in capital, but if it doesn't become plant in service, used and useful, there's really not that big an impact on rates. While it does show up in CWIP and rate base, there's an AFUDC offset. So really capital investments only become impactful once the units or the distribution or the transmission is in service and used and useful. So we're treating capital forecasts as capital that's going into service, and that might not necessarily be true, I think is my upshot here. So when you see this 6% increase year over year in 24 through 30, that could be lower to the extent that some of that capital is spent but not placed into service. Long term, the growth rate is much lower, but that's kind of because you're starting from a higher starting point. And overall, we've kind of used this number as a reference for a lot of scenario analysis to come. This 4.3%, that's all of the full term 2024 to 2053, 4% average growth rate.
So Steve, can I just ask you 2 questions on that slide?
Sure.
So it seems like if we maintain this level of capital investment, it looks like we basically double our rates in 10 or 12 years from where they are now, 10, 11, 12 cents to, north of 20 cents sometime in 2033, 2034, 2035. And it looks like we're like squeezing out the fuel expense. So it seems like there's limits to the steel for fuel, at least once you start getting to capital investments of this order of magnitude. I mean, do I have those 2 pieces of intuition right?
Yeah, I think that's the right observation. Obviously, we can crack open the model and see exactly when we get to double rates, but I think you're seeing that, pardon me, correctly.
All right, keep going.
Like we talked about capital a few slides now. I thought for some historic perspective, I like going back through the Appendix A. It's a fantastic filing. It has all sorts of, detailed information in there about the finances of a utility in Colorado. For public service, I went back 23 through 18 and looked at the year over year changes in plant and service, and it bounces around a lot. 2022 is really low. I think there was a big offsetting retirement in that year. But so plant additions, less retirements, The 5-year total was about 5 billion. So when you think about a 5-year capital investment, forecast of 17 billion compared to where we've been, which is closer to 5 billion with the retirements adjustment, that's really explaining why we're seeing an increase in the growth rate and rates that we haven't seen in the previous 5 years. Yeah, more on capital. So not only is the March 2024 an increase over what we saw historically, there was a fairly large jump in the capital forecast just from the February 2023 investor relations presentation to the March 2024.
Can I ask you a question about that one too?
Sure.
So right now, electric rate base is somewhere between 10 and $11 billion. So in the last year, it sounds like they've increased the 5-year budget by, I guess, somewhere between $8 and $9 billion. I mean, that just seems like a stunning increase that isn't really before us, right? This is what they're telling the financial community. I mean, just any comment on the size of that increase and how it ever gets in front of us? I mean, just
Yeah.
any thoughts?
To be fair, I don't track the Colorado PUC regulatory calendar as closely as I used to. So I'm not exactly sure what cases are ongoing. But yeah, it's undoubtedly a large increase. Eyeballing that, yeah, 8 billion-ish with an adjustment for gas. It is really large. And let's look at the categories. The renewables, I think we share a perspective that capital investment in renewables and some other electric generation assets can be not so bad. If you spend $1 billion on a wind farm, you have a good chance to have offsetting fuel savings in the same range. So lots of times when you look at investments in renewables, that's close, if not exactly, or maybe even rate decreasing. So it's heartening that a big chunk of this increase that you see has to do with renewables. That's that $4 billion chunk. So while it is a big increase, I totally agree, and the model is indicating fairly large capital increase or rate increases. There's hope that the renewables offset some, and then like I mentioned about in service, some of these are going to be longer term capital projects where what's concerning and they'll eventually go into service and hit rates, but maybe it's not in this 5-year time frame. Trying to be glass half full here.
Appreciate it. Just taken aback by the size of these numbers.
Mr. Chairman, a quick question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So two questions about this. You said in the last slide that there was a reduction in the capital expenditure based on retirements of facilities. Does the investment that you used as a capital guide for this, does that include a reduction from miscellaneous retirements that we have in the next 5 years?
No, so this is going to be just the capital investment, but the model does track depreciation of existing rate base. So while it doesn't know that a specific transmission or distribution line is going to reach the end of its useful life in 2028, it does track the appropriate depreciation for existing assets. So it's accounting for existing rate base going down, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Okay. So for example, some large units that are retiring in the next few years, those would be included in the model, or?
Correct. Yep. So to the extent that there's public announcements about retirements of certain large coal plants in Colorado, the model does do its best to account for accelerated depreciation of those, or to the extent that asset has been securitized, it's tracking that and trying to reflect that accurately. Yes.
And do we know, I mean, I'm not sure what goes into these investor presentations. I mean, they're obviously beyond what's been approved. I think they're beyond what's been approved by the commission. Have we looked at, investor presentations in the past and how they track with actual investments, or are they pretty on or off or?
I have not done that analysis, but I think it's reasonable to assume that 5 years from now it might not be exactly 19.2 billion. I just don't have a good sense about how much up or down it may be.
Thanks.
Click. More stuff. So as a first scenario analysis, Aaron's going to go through a lot more of these, but to test the potential that maybe capital doesn't stay at that elevated level forever, we ran a scenario where capital spend gets down to more historical levels, kind of closer to $1 billion a year. That's that gray line that you see, and you can see to the extent that Public Service Colorado gets past Power Pathway and some of the other distribution investments that they're looking at in that capital forecast, to the extent that that's more of a momentary increase in capital investments, you can see that to the extent that capital spending goes down in the future, rates will level off, and looks like the model result is about 2.6% per year, which should be fairly in line with inflation by out in that time frame. But like we said, to the extent that capital stays at the elevated level, you're going to be in that orange line with year-over-year increases more in the 4% range.
So over 25 years, we quadruple rates from 21 levels, 22, 23 levels. And if we keep capital spending after a burst closer to current levels, it's roughly half of what it otherwise would be. So, maybe a little more.
Yeah, not quite half, but in that range, yeah.
All right. Keep going.
California drivers. So started my presentation talking about California and what's going on there. It wasn't in my slide, but the California presentation also identified the run up in gas prices. What was that? 21, 22. We had that big run up in gas prices. It wasn't just in Colorado, it was all over the West. So they identified gas as a potential driver. So we did take a look at running a scenario on gas prices, and it's hard to visually pick up the results. Those lines are all on top of each other. I ran a scenario with gas prices that are $2 higher and $2 lower. And, Public Service Colorado still has a decent amount of coal generation. They have a huge wind and solar portfolio, so there's really just not that much gas. Gas is important because it balances the system. It's really critical for maintaining load reliability, but it's volumetrically, it's just really not all that big. So it's interesting, kind of a simple rule of thumb, that a 1% increase in gas prices, $1 rather, increase in gas prices relates to about a 1% increase in rates, and vice versa. So I thought that was kind of an interesting rule of thumb to come out of this. Other California drivers, net metering, you saw that on my slide. Aaron's going to go through a net metering scenario analysis. But right now, the penetration of solar is much lower in Colorado, so we're not seeing as big a cost shifts right now. Overall, like California, investments in transmission and distribution tend to drive rates up. And with that, I think I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Aaron to talk a little bit more about the scenario analyses.
So Neil.
Yes, good morning, commissioners. So Steve did a great job laying the foundation on this model and providing lots of details regarding the inputs in the base case. Now I get to showcase some of the power of the model in the sort of scenario analysis that it is capable of, and talk through some of those results. I also just wanted to to pause and take a minute and thank Alex Rosen on the Research and Emerging Issues team here. I don't know if this is the right place. I'll thank her like 18 different times, but while she's still online, Alex has worked tirelessly behind the scene to support Steve and I in this presentation and just done a ton of work. So just want to make sure that we are acknowledging her because she's amazing.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right, now if I can get my act together and share our, let's see if I can, all right, does everybody see that?
Yep.
So this is actually going back a little bit into Steve's presentation, but I just wanted to make a couple notes and responses, things that I noticed as he talked through it. So one thing that I just want to be, you know, or mention was, let me back up. Sorry, where did it go? Now, see, this is Steve liked how slowly I transitioned slides, and now I'm going to be frustrated because I wanted to go move faster. This one. So I just wanted to mention that on the companies, and this information comes from the company's investor relations slides. They do have a note on this table that says that this excludes additional generation investment associated with the Colorado Resource Plan, PPA buyouts, and future wind repowering. So that note is on this table for multiple other jurisdictions. So it may be that some of those things like PPA buyouts or wind repowerings may not apply to Colorado, but I just wanted to note that this, as big as it is, may not actually be everything.
Do you know if it includes the wildfire mitigation?
I do not know. My guess would be yes, but I'm not sure. So I think we don't know all of the things that are included in this. And I would note that I expect that it includes at least some of the Colorado energy plan, investments. There is a big additional sort of renewables line compared to last year, which has a lot of, billions of dollars in it. I think that a good chunk of that is the Colorado energy plan. But I just wanted to point out that, again, as big as this number is, it's possible that it's not everything that will come before the commission. Sort of on the flip side of that as well, of the load forecast associated with all of these resources also sort of goes up and down. And from a modeling perspective, need to be very careful that we try to match up the timing of the load forecast and those capital investments. And this load forecast is a little bit older vintage. So, on the flip side, this might not be all the capital that we've got coming at us, but there may be some higher load that is being supported by all this capital investment. So all that to say, like, models are hard. This is the best case set of assumptions based on a lot of very detailed work from Steve to put that together. No model is perfect, but this is going to give the commission a much better sort of overview of sort of holistically everything that is coming before the commission. Also wanted to just quickly mention, sorry, come on, here. Just a couple things on this slide. One is just visually that PTC bar, production tax credits are a credit, not a addition, and that is what is shown here. So that's basically, it should be a deduct. The ultimate revenue requirement is sort of the top of the light green bar because the production tax credits are a deduct to revenue requirement. I just want anybody in the listening public looking at this and saying, hey, production tax credits are a credit. Yes, they are. They have been modeled correctly. It's hard to visually to show a negative, but that is what is happening on this slide. And also wanted to mention that, Steve talked a little bit about the generation mix going forward and sort of it looking like the solar was a smaller portion of the total generation going forward. I think that is consistent with what the company is representing as well. Just to level set, it's sort of nice to know when the modeling kind of is consistent with what the company is saying they think is happening in the long term as well. Part of their investor relations slides, they do show generation mix forecasts, and they do also reflect a bigger and bigger portion of load being covered by wind in the future and a smaller portion by solar. So I think in 2040, the mix is something like predicted to be 80% wind and more like 13 to 15% solar. So again, sort of as a validation of the modeling results and as as much as this sort of dispatch model is a little bit of a dumbed down version compared to what, public service would present, I think that sort of validates some of the results that, we're seeing pretty similar generation mix and things from this relatively simpler model. All right, so all that said, we're going to get to the actual scenarios that I'm supposed to be talking to you all about. So I think, to start off with, just observing that there's a lot of things that impact rates that the commission has somewhat direct influence over, specific approvals of rate of return, capital structure, whether or not we pursue securitization of pieces of rate base. And then there are things that the commission has somewhat less control over, but still has influence. So some of the capital spending does come before you, but a lot of it is ordinary course, and a lot of it is just what's needed to maintain a reliable system. And then a lot of the load modifiers and programs, clean heat, beneficial electrification, net metering, demand response, those sorts of programs come to you as part of a package in a program, maybe a little less direct influence, but certainly, some influence still remains with the commission. So these scenario analysis is trying to understand some of those levers, how much difference they make, how much you have to move those things to see a resulting impact on the rate of increase in rates over time. So I'll just stop here also and say that I'm going to go through each one of these sort of scenarios. I'll try to stop at after each one and just see if there's any questions about takeaways, how it was modeled, what's done, and just do a little bit more pausing for interactive questions. And also say the first two scenarios, Steve and I are going to do a little bit of back and forth. I'm going to set up the scenario and then hand it to him to just pull up the model and show where you would put that in. Part of the purpose of today is to showcase this model, what it can do, how flexible it is, so that hopefully users, staff, other folks can pick this up and use it to get this holistic picture of everything that's going on with the system currently. And also sort of a little bit of a focus that this model is very powerful in terms of comparative analysis, right? This is probably the biggest strength, is not to say that in 2035 the rate is going to be X cents, but to say how much difference do things make, how big a difference, where are we going, getting the overall sense of where rates are headed and what things make a difference for the commission. All right, that said, their first scenario is just looking at a simple adjustment to the utilities weighted average cost of capital. So what's in there as the base case is the company's currently commission approved WACC, 9.3% ROE, approximately 55-44 in terms of capital structure. And the first scenario was to just do a test case, put in 50-50 cap structure, 9% ROE. It's staff running the model, so of course the ROE, that WACC is lower than what is currently approved. Could go the other direction. But anyway, as a test case, that's our first scenario, and I'm going to hand it to Steve just to pull up the model and show where you would make that modification.
So, has everybody seen the model?
Yep.
All right. So this is the general inputs tab that I mentioned earlier. Lots of different, switches that the user can test to evaluate the impacts. But we are doing cost of capital now. And the first change was a 50-50 mix. So here it's set up where you just put in the equity, and then the debt is just 1 minus that. So you don't have to bother changing both. Pardon me, seems to be running a little slow being on Teams here. So you can see things change some, and then we get to also change the ROE. Wait just a moment. You can see it's calculating down here, and that's because I have the dispatch model open, so things are running a little bit slower and much more impactful change there. So the orange line is the base case that we first ran. Oh, wait, pardon me. the blue line is the base case that we ran, and the orange line is the new scenario. And to the extent that you want to see a little bit more about what's going on, there is a tab called Scenario Comparison. And in here you can see the return went down starting at 54 million-ish and growing from there. Obviously, it grows because you have a growing rate base. There'll be a tax impact too. And then this has to do with recent impact. So even though it's a little counterintuitive that that line would be changing, it is accurate. So that's the first scenario. And I will turn that back to Aaron now.
All right. Get my sharing back up. Sorry. By the end, we're going to have this so smooth. All right. So as Steve said, thankfully in the model, what he showed and what I have on my chart look pretty similar. So that's a good start. And this shows, as Steve said, that a change in the ROE and the capital structure does reduce the rate of growth somewhat of rates. So we go from a sort of weighted or average rate increase of 4.3% per year down to 4.2 for the 30-year period of this model. Cumulatively to 2030, that would be result in about 3% lower rates with this lower WACC. So definitely makes a difference. It's not going to suddenly cut the rate of growth in half. So I think that's kind of the main takeaway for this. Matters, but isn't it isn't going to be a magic solution. The next scenario we did was looking at the capital investments. Obviously, that, as we've discussed earlier, is a huge driver of what's going on with the system right now. So one important distinction to make is that there's capital investments that are what we would call non-revenue generating. So things like wildfire investments, transmission investments, aren't necessarily supporting additional load on the system. Transmission maybe kind of, you need it to get there, but it in and of itself isn't supporting any additional load growth. And that has a different kind of impact on rates than revenue generating investments. So to the extent that the investments are supporting transportation electrification or interconnection of new housing, those sorts of things are going to be generating revenue as well as costing. So those are going to have a very different look in terms of the impact on the system. So we did a case just to show the impact of each of those kinds of investment on the system. Actually, let me stop there again, and we're going to turn over to Steve just to show where you would put those in, like, where in the model you'd put in changes to the capital investments or to the revenues associated with them. So stop sharing.
That was a pretty good handoff.
Great.
All right. So adding $10 billion of capital investments in 2029. While you can do some capital modeling in this general inputs tab, it's a little bit more generic. It's kind of that long-term growth rate. But if you want to do something very specific, you go to the capital forecast tab. Come on. I swear when you're using this on your computer, it's much faster. All right. So here is the capital inputs tab. And this is reflective of what you saw in the investor presentation, and then it carries on. So let's say we are going to put this $10 billion into the wildfire and resiliency line item. So right now it's referencing these default inputs down here. So I found the easiest thing to do is just go in here and add 10 billion. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And there it is. $10 billion investment. I'm going to hit F9 so that calculations update, and I'm going to jump back to the general tab to see this impact. So you can see, zoom in for the user, rates are going from about 16 cents up to about not quite 20, more like 19 and a half. So $10 billion shouldn't be surprising to anybody. Big impact on rates. And then that rate impact trails off over time. And that's because this $10 billion, even though it's very large, it's going to depreciate and in the future become less and less of an issue. So now we talked about revenue generating. So looking at the scenario we've been modeling is to increase the growth in energy by 1%, so up from 1.9 to 2.9. And because I think it's safe to assume that, you can't have energy growth without at least some demand growth, we also bumped that up by 1% to 2%. And then I'm going to update the calculations here. And you'll see that previously we still have that big immediate kick, but then the offsetting sales help to, take that $10 million bump and really decrease over time with that large increase in sales. And because we have a change in our energy mix, the dispatch model updated in the background, and we should see all sorts of different interesting results here. There you see the $10 billion increase in plant and service, and it has associated accumulated depreciation and accumulated deferred income taxes. Then you see another kick here, and that's because we increased load. And when we increased load, the model identified that as higher peak demand and would have added one of those generic combined or combustion turbines in there to help offset the load. And then we'll have higher everything because we have we'll have higher return, higher rate base because we have that big capital investment. You're going to have higher O&M and depreciation for various reasons. Scrolling down, you can see, this tracks what is a rough approximation of the electric commodity adjustment. So you can see with the higher level of sales, you should expect to have higher fuel costs, so you should have a higher ECA. And then here's the energy mix. No change in 24 because we did an escalator, so the baseline is the same. But here you can see how the energy mix might change with the addition of that higher load. So going back here, hopefully when I stop sharing and turn this back to Erin, she'll have a similar slide on her deck.
I will.
Steve, can I ask a follow-up question just real quick?
Sure.
That was looking at I guess how to put in kind of discrete future investments or even current if we're in a future year. So I'm presuming that would be doable for say distribution system investments, say that come out of this year's DSP or wildfire expenditures that come out of this year's wildfire plan. Would that sort of hard entering be a relatively accurate way to input kind of outcomes of other proceedings as they play out in real time so that we can make it as accurate as possible with what expenditures we know have been approved?
Yeah, I don't know that docket real well, but I would think that you just want to be careful about not double counting. So to the extent that, out of your DSP proceeding, there's a capital forecast associated with that, you'd want to make sure that's not already somehow embedded in the capital forecast that we saw in that investor presentation deck. So absolutely, you can either do that addition or you can just copy and paste numbers right in. But I would just caution, just make sure you're not double counting anything or undercounting.
Thanks. And then I noticed your lines kind of crossed, even though you put the 10 billion in when you showed it increased sales, basically it caused them to cross. So that would mean even though you had this bump, your rate of increase has not changed, or you're not pegging it to that year as what it's based off of. Because I noticed in the inputs tab, you had what did you call it? The base year for those escalators. So if you said, well, this is the new normal, I'm supposing you would change the base year to be that year with that. new boost or difference in
Oh,
capital
yeah.
spend?
Yeah. So we had the capital boost in 2029, but the increase load started right away in 2025. Yeah. To line those two up, to do a different version of the scenario, you could go in there and have the load start increasing specifically in 2029 to match that bump in capital. That you couldn't do that from the general inputs tab. You'd have to go to the load inputs tab and be a little bit more specific about it, but you could easily do that.
Okay, thanks. And then just one other question. I know you had mentioned the kind of generic assumption is gas CTs essentially for new coincident peak, I think, generation. Is that something that cost assumption, I presume, could be edited somewhere, either to reflect ERP results or whatever we determine to be the most accurate? So can you maybe just show us where that is really quickly?
Sure.
Oh, next time you have control. You're not in control. Next time you pop up.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I don't want to
Well,
overcomplicate
actually, I
things.
don't know that I'm popping up again, so maybe I
Oh,
will
okay.
take the opportunity
Sorry.
to jump in here. So 30-year rate model, share. Yep. And so you're right. It's one of these light blue tabs over here, new unit costs.
Okay.
In this tab, I kind of had a screenshot of what I had from Energy Information Administration. And then over here, so I have a gas peaker, capital cost in 22 looked like 867. It has some escalation on it because we know past couple of years haven't been normal. So when we get into this time frame, when we're adding them, they're right in the $1,000 range. And same for intermediate peaker and solar, et cetera.
Okay, great. And any of these inputs, I suppose, could be overridden with more accurate later information in like future ERPs, say, something like that.
Absolutely. So you can either change this 2022 value and have things escalate, or you can just go ahead and overwrite these and put in your own kind of custom escalation on those.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and just one note on that, since we were talking about the just to clarify, because the way that the capacity expansion is done now is there's an assumption about continued additions for wind, solar, and storage. The CTs are filling in to the extent that you run the dispatch model and you don't have sufficient capacity, it will add CTs to make sure that you don't have a reliability problem. It's not that it's forecasting additions for CTs. It's sort of you put in the assumptions about the renewable side, and it will make sure the system sort of solves. Right, Steve? Yeah. Just want to make sure we're not throwing a ton of CTs at it. It's not like this is a gas-based model. So anyway. All right, now let me get back to sharing. So as Steve sort of mentioned, obviously a non-revenue generating, chunk of investment is going to tend to increase rates. Just for sort of order of magnitude comparisons, you can think a little bit about, $10 billion is a little bit more, but about the difference in the company's capital budget plan last year to this year. So that, obviously that happens over a 5-year period. We're just putting in a slug all at once, but it's that kind of difference, saying that level of $10 billion is going to cause a, 22%-ish increase in rates fairly immediately. That difference will decline a little bit over time with depreciation, but it's going to obviously tend to drive up the annual growth rate of rates. In this instance, from 4.3 to 4.4%, and then to the extent that there is revenue associated with that, is going to tend to drive that down. The 1%-ish number is roughly consistent. The company's load forecast from the phase 2 of the ERP, which was used as this, to the most recent annual update, is about a 1% increase in load growth. So just sort of order of magnitude, those things are kind of matched. Obviously, the details matter a lot in this instance. Exactly how much capital, exactly how much load, but just in terms of rough numbers of where these kinds of scenarios come from, this may be-ish reasonable in terms of thinking about the balance between the capital and the amount of revenue that it would support. And obviously that load growth makes a big difference to the impact on rates, right? A 1% difference in annual revenue and load growth makes a big difference, driving down that sort of average rate of annual growth rate in rates from 4.3 down to 3.5%. So I promised I was going to stop after each scenario and then forgot to stop after the ROE scenario. So taking up just a quick pause on sort of the capital scenarios. I don't know if there's any other questions about these, how the modeling is done, sort of takeaway messages, anything like that. Okay, we will keep going. Scenario 3 is sort of a little bit the flip side of just looking at sort of straight up additional load growth, but then also what happens if that load growth is discounted. So there is load that gets added to the system, but that doesn't end up contributing at the fully tariff rates, but that is discounted. We have economic development rates in the state, and takeaway from the last message, our last slide was, load growth matters a lot. I think the takeaway here is that if that new load that shows up isn't contributing at the fully embedded cost, it's not going to help nearly as much. So sort of, again, orienting to these slides, right? Our gray line is just giving us a baseline inflation rate. The blue line is our base case scenario. The orange line says, what if we get an additional 1% of growth? That's going to help a lot to help moderate the increase in rates over time. But that dashed line says, if that load growth is being delivered at a discounted rate, and this is specifically assuming that that's an industrial customer and that it gets an 18% discount based, as a result of economic development rates, that's not going to show up as nearly beneficial to the system. In the limit, right, if that discount got them all the way back up to the marginal cost of serving them, it would be right on top of that blue line, right? We wouldn't be getting any benefit to that system and from that additional load. So the level of the discount matters, and whether that is discounted load matters a lot to the benefits that it's delivering for the system.
Hey, Aaron, so just to be clear, this is like at an average rate. This shows transportation electrification, and more an average residential rate than an industrial rate, which presumably would be less of a benefit.
So the orange line is saying that you're just getting 1% increased load growth across the board. So it's 1% in residential, industrial, commercial, all of it. And then the dashed line is saying if that 1% that showed up were industrial load and that industrial load were discounted, that's what impact would be. So the dashed line is a industrial specific scenario, assuming that industrial customers have somewhat lower rates to begin with, but then you're discounting those. So how much benefit does that get? Does that make sense? Okay. The other thing to know about this is, from a modeling perspective, this was sort of a case we were particularly interested in sort of understanding the impact of rate discounts. Does require a little bit more sort of post-processing and mucking with the modeling and stuff to come up with. So sort of the cases we've been running through are fairly standard, like here's the input, the nice little blue cells that we can change ROE pretty quickly. This particular scenario took a little bit more from a modeling perspective. It's a little less plug and play. It obviously can be done with this model, but just in terms of thinking about showcasing what's sort of automatic with the model and what just, you need to kind of get a little bit more under the hood. This is a little bit more of an under the hood model scenario. All right. Our fourth example was securitization. I would sort of characterize this as a little bit as a bounding exercise, sort of saying like, how much can we move the needle if we really throw everything at securitization? So the case that we ran was looking at securitizing $10 billion worth of rate base every 4 years. So this isn't a one and done. This is like saying, if we're adding 17 billion of rate base every 5 years, we're going to take a good chunk of that, every so often and securitize that. So assumption is that the financing cost of that securitization is more like 4% instead of WACC, which is closer to 7%. But again, we're securitizing a good chunk of the company's rate base. And based on that, sort of what I would consider a pretty aggressive securitization pathway. It moves that annual growth rate from 4.3% down to 4%. So definitely meaningful, but it doesn't get us back down to inflation. It's sort of makes a difference, but isn't any sort of magic solution. And also just note that securitization of different kinds of rate-based assets may or may not require changes in statutory authority. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not here to advise you on what you do or do not have the ability to securitize now. So just adding that little caveat. So any questions, thoughts on securitization? All right. Scenario number 5 is, as Stephen mentioned earlier, in terms of net metering penetration, the state of Colorado is currently, we have I think it's about between 4% and 5% penetration of behind the meter solar, rooftop solar now. California is at more like 12%. So we are, well behind where California is currently, but do have a significant, it is a meaningful amount of behind the meter solar now. So we wanted to look at sort of what is the impact, given that, especially since it is one of the big drivers of the rate increases in California, looking at what do those cases look like for Colorado. So looked at 2 different sort of pathways for net metering. One where we sort of doubled the rate at which we're increasing the behind the meter solar. So that would put us about where California is in 2034. So they're about 12% penetration now. So the first case is that sort of that 2-time bar, that they're 2 times bar, the middle yellow one is, we would be where California is about 10 years later. So sort of lagging by about 10 years. And then the next case is a little bit more aggressive, saying we would be at 16% by 2034. So that means basically we'd be where California is today in 2030. So it's a sort of just different ways to think about acceleration of rooftop solar in the state. And the results of that are meaningful, right? The 2 times rate gets us to a 4.5% annual rate of increase in our rates, and the 3 times gets us to 4.8%. So I think my takeaway from that is sort of we are 10 years behind where California is, but that may accelerate going forward. We don't know. All of this assumes that we're talking about just solar, that load that shows up doesn't provide storage for the system as well. So there's definitely a peak load implication of assuming a sort of pure solar world. I think the conclusion is the cost shift associated with solar may not be big right now, but the potential is there for it to be a big deal and much more significant as we go forward, particularly as we get to what levels of penetration that look more like California. So that impact is well worth thinking about and trying to plan for. Any questions, thoughts on net metering? All right. And then our last scenario is looking at demand response. This is a little squishier in the sense of I'm not sure exactly what the reasonable assumptions are. I think the commission has generally struggled with sort of what is the potential for demand response programs and what does that look like over time. But in terms of the bounding exercise of trying to figure out what moves the needle, the test case here was, taking the demand response that we have today and basically projecting that to be 5 times higher in the future. So that's something like 150 to 200 megawatts additions of demand response every year. It's a pretty aggressive case in terms of the impact on the system, and the response is, again, similarly to other things, it does move the needle, but not a ton. So it's 4.3 to 4.1% in terms of the annual growth rate, and that's for a pretty aggressive demand response scenario. Yeah, so that's takeaway there. Yes, Commissioner Gilman.
Hi. Is there any way to model or look at demand response somewhat as a function of the increase in electric sales? Kind of so you can tie the two together to better understand, like, I mean, within reason, if you have more load, you're selling more, the pie got bigger. Do those attach to each other in any way, or can they attach to each other in any way?
Yeah, so no, excellent question. So I think the short answer is that that's not how it was modeled, but yes, absolutely. So I mean, I think you can put in sort of, as Steve was showing earlier, specific forecasts that can be as a rate of growth or a specific forecast of what you think it will be, or as a percentage of the load, so that those things scale together. I think the model is very flexible in being able to input those things that different. So I'll let Steve talk.
Yeah, no, I agree with what you said. I think it's probably best approach to set up a separate spreadsheet with the relation between demand response and load that you want, and have that in there, and then just copy and paste a new forecast of load, and then copy and paste a new forecast of DR in the model, and I think that should work really easy.
Okay, so it's an input, we'd figure it out elsewhere and then put it as an input here.
Exactly. They're not tied to each other right now, and I don't think it'd be really hard to do it in the model right now. So I think it's better handled. Do the correlation in a spreadsheet outside, and then just copy and paste the results right in. I think that'd be the easiest approach.
And you'd put them on the load forecast page, load forecast and expansion plan, or would you simply update the percentages somehow for the annual escalation rate?
I would put it into the load forecast tab, and I think there's a separate DR tab with year by year inputs.
Well, it's on there, like a line 13, I guess, has demand response right under
there it
peak
is.
demand.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
okay.
Line 13. Yep, you're right. So it's not a separate tab, it's in the load one. So you can do it all in one tab.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So I think sort of in conclusion, hopefully this has provided a little bit of background on the model, demonstrated the capabilities of it. I think this is a really powerful tool, particularly for the commission to get that holistic look at all of the pieces of rate base and load and programs all together. That's the intent, and I think it does a really good job of that. I think it's also a really powerful tool for doing these sort of scenario analyses of what moves the needle, how much, what is the impact of different flavors of programs and capital spending, and looking at the relationships between capital and load and things like that. So hopefully that this is the tool that the commission will find useful going forward. I think in terms of takeaways and looking at the particular base case and scenarios we've presented, I think it's inescapable the idea that the capital spending is dominating pretty much everything else. That 16-17 billion dollars worth of capital spending in the next 5 years, and assumptions about continuing that level of investment really drives a lot of rate increases, and that savings isn't going to be made up by fuel going forward. I'm not saying that Steel for Fuel is not going to provide any benefits at all, but the major shift in reduction in fuel costs has already happened, and that going forward, it's a lot more about the capital and what load it may or may not support. So, to the extent that it's driving incremental beneficial electrification, transportation electrification, growth in new housing stock, that's going to matter a lot. That relationship between capital spending and load growth is the biggest driver. There are other levers that do matter in a meaningful way: securitization, capital structure, ROE, demand response. I'm not saying that those things aren't important. I think the other message that I would take away from this for the commission is that it's going to take everything, that this is a big challenge to continue to maintain what Colorado has enjoyed, which is relatively low, stable electricity prices, and that we're going to be faced with continuing pressures on affordability, and that all of the tools in the proverbial toolbox will be needed to help manage the challenge going forward. Yeah, And with that, I mean, I don't know if there's other questions, general observations, hand it back to you all.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just struggling with, particularly on the capital spending, if you have any advice how we get a handle on this. Like to Mr. Wishart's point, it seemed like, when we're investing in renewable energy that's coming out of a, full ERP process with extensive planning, extensive oversight by the parties, and you still have fuel savings or coal plants that are unretired, that just seems like a good, well-supported investment. But it seems like where the planning is less robust elsewhere, how do we get this big picture view into stuff that historically only come to us on after the fact prudency in a rate case? I guess we have to be asking for, the capital budgeting as part of, how the incremental proposal influences the whole thing as supplemental direct in each case. I mean, I'm just struggling with how do we get a view? The company presented to the financial community an $8 billion, an $8 to $9 billion increase that somehow never comes to us. At least pieces of it. So I don't know. Do you have any advice on a process perspective about how we get a handle on this, Mr. Wishart, Ms. O'Neill?
So I guess my first response, Chairman, is that like this is the start of that conversation, right? This tool, this showcase of what it can do. I think as you said, the commission sort of been asking for something that gives this view for a while. And I think public service has been trying, and we've been trying and like making progress towards getting this look at the future. So I do think this is the start of that conversation. In some ways, now it's up to the company and parties to sort of pick up this conversation and try to give you this 20,000-foot view of everything all together. I think the commission can continue to ask for it in proceedings, and help parties understand this is the holistic look that the commission is interested in, right? So hopefully that's a little bit of today's message, as to pick this up and try to put it things specific applications in context.
And I guess I mean, I'm just like struggling with what the next steps are. I mean, what we rate base investments that grow revenue or reduce costs, and securitize investments that are non-revenue generating. I mean, I'm just struggling with how we manage these long-term rate impacts. I don't know, Mr. Wishart, you've been on various sides of the fence. Any guidance, advice about how we manage to this risk and concern?
Yeah. Being in my former job as a pricing and rates guy, I would look at potential impacts of net metering. Lots and lots of states have moved on from traditional net metering. So I think there's some potential rate relief pressure there. And then the long-term capital forecast in there, I think there is possibility that we do see some relief just naturally after you get over a bump. I know a lot of the transmission is power pathway, and then there's some associated transmission investment from the resource plan. So hopefully, without even taking action, you'll see at least a bit of relief on the capital from that perspective.
But aren't they? Isn't the company committing the 5% a year earnings per share and dividend growth? How do they do that if they don't keep growing capital? I mean, that's a fear with letting that capital grow in the next 5 years like this. How do you manage it down?
Yeah. Well, capital finance is not an area of my expertise, but being a simple mathematician, earnings per share, there's two numbers there. There's earnings and there's number of shares. So maybe it's more of a thoughtful management on the number of shares. So simple caveman math, but that's one alternative.
I don't know, Commissioner Gilman, thoughts, questions, comments?
I have another question just about what kind of in here in the initial model that we're seeing. A few scenarios. I just want to understand what's in here. The first is as far as like decommissioning costs for retirements we already know will happen. To what extent are those in there? To what extent do we forecast like decommissioning costs or retirements for other assets without announced retirement? And related but different in terms of just your run-of-the-mill, you know, not a giant power plant, are there assumptions, be it for decommissioning or like a net salvage value to reflect the end of life costs associated with any of this new infrastructure we're seeing be put in?
There is. Decommissioning costs, not as big an issue on the electric side as the gas side. I think we've had a conversation on the gas side that removal work in process on the gas side almost doubles the depreciation on some gas pipelines. But that's an input that is in there, adjustable by the user. So that's accounted for. To the extent that there is a large decommissioning upcoming that isn't financed through earlier, faster depreciation associated with expected retirement costs, that is not in there unless there's been some public announcement, and that's a certain capital or O&M investment that you can put in the model. So it's probably a little bit light on all the retirement stuff, but it is in there.
Okay, so as far as like the retirements that have been announced with some assumption of decommissioning costs are.
To the extent I pick them up, yeah. And if they're not in the model, they're easy to add.
Okay. Maybe we can find out which ones are in there, like got picked up. That would be helpful. Just, I don't know what I'm looking for. If I'm looking for something that's missing. And then can you show where there's that concept for essentially, I think you were saying there is some decommissioning or net costs assumed for like your run-of-the-mill infrastructure in here? Does that get added into the depreciation from the beginning?
It is, yeah. So there's a salvage input, and I think the concept when people initially set this up is that you'd be able to sell it and make some money. But obviously, we know with power plants, it's the opposite, and you're going to end up spending some money. So instead of being a positive, it's a negative, and that just changes the depreciation schedule. So over the course of the life of $100 million asset, you'll probably depreciate it 120 million. So you have that extra 20 million for the decommissioning.
Okay. Yeah. If you could just show me or let me know where that input is, it doesn't have to be this second. That would be great.
I will follow up with you for sure.
Thank you.
I want to say one more thing regarding your question, Chairman, which I think is in some ways like there is not one answer, right? That on the net metering, maybe it's encouraging more storage to show up with the solar, and there's looking at rate design, and there's, you know, adjustments here, and like it isn't one thing. And yeah, and I mean, obviously there's not a decision in front of you that I would probably be inappropriate for me to opine on one if there were, but just like there's nothing that's going to, you know, suddenly change the dynamics here of needing transmission and distribution. And like, it's a lot of hard, detailed work to figure out creative solutions for everything and then put it in context with the whole and see how it all works together. And I know that's not a very, like, it's not a very satisfying answer, but I think that's right.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe as we improve our distribution system planning and our transmission planning, you know, there's you feel better about these investments. It seems like the net metering, as long as we keep to current growth rates, probably doesn't have a huge impact, or if we start shifting to solar plus storage. Just one question about next steps. I wonder if you thought about trying to link this rate model more to the Encompass modeling run. So it's tied closer to what the company is doing. and maybe adding, differentiating a little bit between industrial, commercial, and residential rates. And I know it was beyond the scope of this. We were looking at average rates, but the rate, and it sounds like on our rate discount graph, we did discount it off industrial rates. It sounds like,
We
so
did.
maybe that's already in there. But any thoughts on trying to link it to the Encompass runs?
Yeah, so I'll jump in and say, like, I think the most immediate next step is sort of doing a little bit of cleanup, and we were going to post both these slides and the model, including the dispatch generator, on our website, so other parties will have access to this tool. And then I think in terms of focuses going forward, there's certainly desire, I think, from the commission's part to make sure that we're also looking at the gas side of the equation and potentially the linkage between the gas and electric from a beneficial electrification perspective, as well as probably having some amount of, I don't know, like cleanup, but enhancements on the electric model. But a lot of that is going to depend on Mr. Wishart's time and our ability to contract and pay for the huge value that Steve has brought in forward to the commission in this model.
Well, I just want to thank you both and Ms. Rosen for a really helpful tool and discussion. I've been struggling for years to try and get a handle on this, and I think this is a major step forward. So thanks so much. Really enjoy the conversation and the framing. Commissioner Gilman, any final thoughts before we adjourn?
Yeah, I have a short wish list for Miss O'Neill and Miss Rosen, probably. To me, this seems like a great tool, but it will really be upon us to make sure it doesn't get stale or become irrelevant as we move forward. And so I would really love if Miss O'Neill and Miss Rosen could help us to put together a list and essentially identify major proceeding types or types of outcomes in proceedings that should be inputted into this model. I'm imagining the sort of hard entering we went through with Mr. Wishart, in that we know now this whatever proceeding came to a close, we know what they're planning on spending on X type part of the system. To first of all, if that was something that was done by our staff, we could update it to the website with like the most current actual assumptions as of then. We'd all be working from the same set of music. I worry about everyone trying to update this themselves with what they think the outcome was or whatever. So I think that would be really helpful because this is like today, and we've got however many giant proceedings open or about to happen that will heavily influence what some of these costs are, at least over the next several years. And then along those lines, but a little different, if y'all could also kind of identify key outputs of this model, that would be helpful to look at in upcoming proceedings, so that we can have enhanced kind of consistency and transparency across proceedings in terms of what assumptions are being used for, let's say, just pulling it out of thin air, but a megawatt of additional capacity on coincident peak. To me, it is untenable to continue to have different assumptions used across different proceedings. So to the extent that I don't think there's any way we can guarantee like who will use that in their arguments, but to the extent that we could have something that helps us to understand like what outputs of this are the types of things that are useful across proceedings, to kind of understand those and ideally move to a place of more consistency in what assumptions are being used. I think those two things would help this like be really durably useful for us in the future.
I think those are great thoughts and as follow-ups and things we can support.
We're not voting today, but I'd echo Commissioner Gilman's comments.
Thank you. Appreciate the support. But anyway, I would add my voice to the chorus of thank yous to you, Miss O'Neill, and Miss Rosen, Mr. Wishart. I've never seen a spreadsheet I didn't love, and I like this, so I'm looking forward to. Well, I have seen some awful spreadsheets, but this looks nice. We can use it. We can look at it. And I think, we're just gonna have to work hard to keep it current because a lot goes on all the time. And almost all of this, no offense to anyone, is out of date next month. So
No, I'm thinking of it as like
we
a maintenance plan of like, how do we maintain this? And I think your thoughts about sort of version control as well is, really important.
yeah, even, we're hearing kind of thoughts that the ERP pricing may change or something might change, right? So being able to have like a plan to update and get us accurate will be a really important part of this. So, but thanks to you all. Really look forward to using it and poking around and trying some things, seeing how it works.
Me too. It's a fun tool. So.
And I agree with you. I guess I should also say, I mean, I agree with the chairman on the general concern here and just need to see this all put together and played out in the longer term to understand how it works. Whether you're looking kind of minute, like granularly at electrification and how that looks for customers, or in the big picture of all of the kind of just decarbonization, load growth related or not to decarbonization that we see happening. I think it's important that we understand the bigger picture of this to ensure that we really can be making the best decisions possible. So I think this is helpful. Thanks.
All right. Well, again, deep appreciation to both you and Ms. Rosen, and thanks for the discussion. And we're adjourned. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.